Wow. Welcome to the Bella Unplugged. And at first, I'd like to welcome my audience. So, to the community of Facebook and to the community of Twitter, better known as X, and to the amazing community of LinkedIn. And of course, last but certainly not least, my loyal subscribers to YouTube. Welcome to the Bella Unplugged. As I said a couple of months ago, I'm bringing you the best of the best for the programming. I want to take a few minutes to do my salutations and greetings and thank every single person who has subscribed to the Bella Unplugged over the last 4 years. I do not count it on robbery but joy because I know there are hundreds of thousands of YouTubers, podcasters, in the beautiful world of YouTube, and the few thousand people who subscribe to me, the couple of 100,000 who have gone in and actually looked at each one of my videos. I thank you. This is a program of integrity, and who I have today are two amazing women. We're going to talk about legacy. What does the word legacy mean? Well, I tell you what, Webster says this: legacy is something transmitted or received from an ancestor or predecessor or from the past. The legacy of ancient philosophers. That's just one example. But I do want to take the time, these two amazing women share a little bit to do today. Now, a lot of my YouTube channel have seen A'Lelia Bundles and Michelle Duster before. I'm going to let each one of them take their time. They're going to tell you a little bit about who they are and the lineage, right? But first of all, as I'm very calm, you all know I'm on a different energy because I really want everyone to lean in. And as you're listening to this broadcast, think about what is your legacy? What are you going to leave behind? Because everyone has a legacy. Don't you think that you should create your own legacy as opposed to have someone create it for you? So I want to do a couple of welcomes. I want to shout out to Queen Monique. Thank you for coming in. Queen Lakeisha, King Wise. There's 100 people. I tell you, A'Lelia, I tell you, Michelle, who have followed you, who have purchased your books, and they absolutely get it. But then there's a large crowd out there that don't know who you are. So first, I am going to talk less, community, because we want to hear from these ladies. It's going to be around 1 hour, full hour. These women are busy just as you are. So I hope you are enjoying your dinner hour on this beautiful, amazing Friday, April 19th, 2024. And please listen as we lean in and share our hearts. First up, I'm going to let A'Lelia Bundles talk a little bit. She's amazing. A'Lelia Perry Bundles. She's an American journalist. She's a news producer and an author. She's known for one of her 2001 biographies of her great great grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker. She hails from Chicago, so shout out. I got a lot of partners from Chicago, so shout out to Chi-Town. Y'all know I'm from Baltimore, so shout out to B More. Next, we're also going to talk a little bit with Michelle Duster, who is an American author and a public historian. Did y'all hear what I said? A public historian. She's known for her work to preserve the legacy, that's the key word tonight, ladies and gentlemen, of her great grandmother. That's one great, not two, Ida B. Wells. She's an American educator and so much more. Let me tell you something. It's not enough time to go and dissect, but we're going to cover the surface, talk about legacy, and please, if you have questions, validated questions, please put them in the chat. This is an interactive broadcast, and I will definitely ask A'Lelia and or Michelle your question. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and take it with our sorority sister, A'Lelia Bundles first. A'Lelia, welcome the community. Tell them a little bit about yourself, and then we'll move on to Michelle.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I know Michelle and I really enjoy sharing our stories, and we're so fortunate that our ancestors actually knew each other. So it makes the relationship even more special. But my name is A'Lelia Bundles, and Bella, while I was born in Chicago, I did not grow up in Chicago, so we cannot say I'm from Chicago. Michelle is from Chicago. I grew up in Indianapolis, and Indianapolis is where the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company was headquartered. So when I was growing up, my mom was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, and I would go with her to her office and watch as the ladies mix the hair care products, Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. So I had a mom who was a business executive, but my real passion was writing. And I thought of myself as a writer from the age of 8. And I became a journalist in junior high and high school. And then I had a 30-year career as a network television news producer and then executive, about half the time at NBC and the other half at ABC News. I've been gone from that daily journalism life for almost 20 years. And for the last 20 years, I have served on a number of nonprofit boards, including being a trustee at Columbia and being chairman of the board at the National Archives Foundation. And I have written 4 books, including On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, which you mentioned. And I am doing the final edits now for my 5th book called Joy Goddess, Alelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, where I talk about Madam Walker's daughter and her life in Harlem and with all of the people, the famous artists and writers and musicians who she knew. And so I have spent 5 decades really telling these women's stories and really trying to tell the accurate story of their lives. And I think now people do know more about Madam Walker's life because of some of the work we've done. I think Alelia Walker's story is still pretty distorted and inaccurate. And so I can't wait for this new book to come out next spring.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Lillian. And we are here. So, community, as I ask you to lean in, figuratively speaking, lean in, listen, and learn the accurate information of historian, okay? The accuracy of it. Next up, Michelle. Come on in, Michelle. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, we're all sorority sisters. We're all family. We're going to interact for this hour. Tell my community a little bit about who you are and who your descendant is.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Linda and Delia. And I have done several programs together, and it's always so much fun, having these interactions. So I am originally born and raised in Chicago, still live in Chicago, and I have lived in other places, so I do have a little bit of perspective of how Chicago has its own uniqueness to it. And so I'm really 4th generation Chicago. Husband Ferdinand Barnett lived here, although neither one of them were born and raised here because that was like the 1840s to 60s. But yeah, they spent most of their adult life in Chicago. And most people don't know, when they hear my great grandfather Ferdinand Barnett, they just think Ida's husband. But I actually am very intrigued by his story as well. And just one little thing about him was that he was the founder of the Conservator newspaper, which was the first Black-owned newspaper in Chicago before the Defender. And so that's, so I have 2 ancestors who were amazing. But Ida B. Wells gets, she gets most of the attention, which is some kind of, twist, a little twist, right? Because most of the time the men are the ones who receive the attention. But in their situation, he was Ida's husband. And my grandmother was one of their 4 children. She was the youngest of their 4 children. I say that because Ferdinand had 2 children from a previous marriage. Ida was his second wife. So a lot of people don't know that she was a stepmother, in addition to having 4 children of her own. And so my grandmother was the youngest of all of the kids. Her name was Elfrida Barnett. And because there was Ferdinand Barnett. And then Ida B. Wells got married to him, and so she hyphenated her name to Ida B. Wells Barnett. So my grandmother and her siblings had the last name Barnett. So my grandmother was Alfreda Barnett, and she married a man named Benjamin Doster. And so that's how I have the last name Doster, because I am the daughter of my grandmother's middle son. My grandmother had 5 children. And I've kept the name Doster. So, but that's funny because a lot of people are like, why don't you have the last name Wells? And I'm like, well, women get married, and so this is how I have the last name Doster. And so, like I said, I was born and raised in Chicago, proud product of Chicago Public Schools. Spent time on the East Coast. I went to Dartmouth College, which was interesting, in New Hampshire, coming from Chicago. And I've spent most of my career working in some form of communication. That's where A'Lelia and I have so much in common when it comes to our backgrounds. Even before I met her, I had read her bio, and I was like, wow, this woman and I have so much in common. Not just because we're a descendant of historical people, but she and I, as individual people, have very similar career paths. She worked in broadcast media. I worked in film and film production, and I worked in for a little while in the music industry, and I've worked in advertising. And then I started focusing about 16 years ago on my family story, because I kind of decided, I'm tired of helping multi-million-dollar companies make more multi-million dollars. So I had the skill set and the knowledge base to produce work. And so I decided to kind of switch focus and use my skill set to jump in here into the pool of telling our history, not my family history specifically, but Black history and women's history, because one of the things that sort of influenced me, all of my career choices, or sort of the path that I've taken, has been to counter what I feel are false narratives about who we are as a people. And I felt that way from a really young age. Even when I was, a young person watching television shows that were supposedly targeted to the Black community, I felt like they were entertaining and I watched the shows, but I still didn't see myself. And so I didn't see my experience. And I felt like so many of the media images that were being promoted then and now were sort of skewed to experiences that were different than mine. And when a certain show came out, it's terrible, because it's like, you're kind of scared to say the name of it, but a television show that showed a middle class, 2-career married couple who had children in a nice home and all of these, that was my life. And people made it seem like, well, that's not really the Black experience. And I'm like, yes, it is. There are Black people like this. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to help add to the narrative to the diversity of the Black experience. And so that's kind of been my focus and goal.
Let me tell you something, Michelle and A'Lelia, those are great openings. Michelle, I'll start with you since you just spoke. Ida B. Wells is a shero to me because I'm also a historian, right? And shout out to Baltimore, because I hail from Baltimore, A'Lelia. You know that, and Michelle, but I've been living in Atlanta for the last 27 years. Oh my God. It'll be 21 years this June. And let me tell you something. Michelle, I want you to help me because I read a lot. And I remember in Washington, D.C. at Union Station, isn't there some type of acknowledgement for your great-grandmother? Because I remember going to Union Station maybe 7 or 8 years ago, because I'm living in Baltimore. I go home often to the DMV, and I believe I saw like a outline of your great grandmother's face. Can you talk a little bit about that in Union Station? Am I right or am I wrong?
Well,
I
I didn't
saw it
live
in
in
Union Station.
Chicago, and so I haven't really spent very much time in Union Station, but in DC. But in 2020, you know, it was the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and Ida B. Wells was involved in the suffrage movement. And there was a huge tribute to her. There was a mosaic that was in her image, and the mosaics are like one big picture that are made out of small pictures. And so it was a mosaic of her, but there were lots of, I mean, I don't even know how many hundreds of photos that were part of that to make that image. And it was on Union Station floor. And I only saw pictures of it because it wasn't there very long. It was during the pandemic, and it was in another city where I don't live. But you know, from the pictures that I saw, it was gigantic, and it was just a really, really huge tribute to her, but also all of the other suffragists. And that was the point of it, because the suffrage movement was so elaborate. And so you have thousands and thousands of women who were part of the movement. And I know that's what the artist was trying to show, was that, you know, to sort of give tribute to all of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement. So for that mosaic, people could go up close on it and look at the individual pictures and really see the images of these hundreds and hundreds of women that were part of the suffrage movement. But that was a temporary exhibit. I don't know of another one that has stayed at Union Station, but that's the one that I'm familiar with that was there.
And that's the one I'm talking about because I happened to go on business and I actually walked on it. So, Michelle, I just
Okay.
want you to, we're always connected. I have a question for you, Michelle, before I go to Alelia. Now, for some of people that know who I am, I'm very entrenched to the League of Women Voters of the state of Georgia. I was the past president, the second African American. And that's actually where I met our soror Alelia Bundles a few years ago. She came on to the League of Women Voters, remember Alelia, and spoke eloquently. My question to you is this, Michelle. I learned about Ida B. Wells through many faces through my parents, but in the League of Women Voters, she's a big deal. So can you talk a little bit about your great grandmother and some of the things she did? Because she did allegedly, right here I go, Michelle, allegedly walked in the back of the parade for the suffrage movement, which was in 1920, which is what we were told, that turned into what we know as the League of Women Voters in 1920. So please dispel that myth, Michelle.
I honestly don't know her association with the League of Women Voters. She was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was founded in 1896 in Washington, D.C. And that organization was a sort of a melding of different Black women's clubs that were around the country, and they decided to sort of merge into this one organization in order to have sort of more collective. And that organization, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, was focused on a lot of different issues, not only suffrage. And that's one of the challenges when it comes to documenting the history of Black women in the suffrage movement, because Black women, unlike white women, or sort of had a different approach than white women, because Black women incorporated the right to vote, the fight for the right to vote, along with other rights. And so it was sort of this interwoven kind of activism versus some, I can't say all, you never can say all, but I would say most of the white women's suffrage organizations were focused on suffrage, on getting the right to vote. But Black women were like, hey, we need, working conditions, we need housing conditions, we need all of these different issues, and voting will help us get to that point. So she was involved in that organization. And then in Chicago, she was involved in a couple of other, she was incredibly busy. It's kind of dizzying, just kind of trying to figure out how does she manage 4 children, a husband, a house, and all these different organizations. And still writing, newsletters. Oh my God, it was just crazy. But she was involved in a couple of different suffrage organizations, which I can't remember the names of all of them because there are just so many. But then she started her own suffrage organization called the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was for Black women in 1910. Wait, no, 1913 was when she started that. And then she participated in the parade in Washington, D.C., the suffrage parade, just a few months later, right before Woodrow Wilson was, the day before he was inaugurated. And the story that you mentioned, I'm familiar with it being connected to that particular march in 1913 in Washington, D.C., where it was the largest parade or the largest sort of demonstration, if you want to call it that, that women had organized to that point, which was about 5,000 women from all over the country. And they were lobbying or sort of trying to influence Woodrow Wilson to finally sign legislation for women to have the right to vote. And, so the organizer, where they were going to march to for them to march in the back of the parade. And my great grandmother had gone to Washington with the members of the other women from Illinois who were all white. I think she was the only Black person in that delegation. There were 62 people in the delegation. And so the organizers, I guess, went to where they were rehearsing and said, there's a request that Black women march in the back of the parade. And it's kind of a long story. So to shorten it, she allegedly, because I wasn't there, so I can only go by what I've read about. But she allegedly agreed, with sort of fingers crossed behind her back. And then they couldn't find her when the parade started, and she had gone along the side of the route of the parade and along kind of the sidewalk, and then she jumped out of the crowd when the Illinois delegation reached where she was, front and center of the Illinois delegation. So there was nothing the organizers could do to stop her at that point. So she's credited with desegregating that parade. So that's the story that I've heard. I don't know about what happened in 1920.
That's the story, and we're sticking with it, Michelle. I love it. I love it. I love it. Now, Lilia, I'm telling you, I want you to talk a little bit just to familiar, because we don't have enough time, as Michelle knows this, to talk a little about the Netflix series documentary about your great grandmother. Can you tell me about that, please?
Well, before I do that, I'd really like to talk about what the real story so I can help sort of level set on that. And so, when people hear Madam Walker's name, they think of hair care products. And yes, she absolutely was a pioneer in the modern hair care industry. She was solving her own hair loss issue and created hair care products. And then developed a business that employed thousands of women. She trained women. She had beauty schools. She traveled all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America, and created a Walker sales agents, a force, a sort of an army of agents. And then those agents were able to become economically independent, to buy homes, to educate their children. She wanted them to be leaders. A key story for me is that in 1917, when she had her first national convention of her sales agents in Philadelphia, she said to the women in her keynote speech, "I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others." She gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products or recruited the most agents, but to the women who had contributed the most to charity in their communities. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So, and then Madam Walker was one of the people who helped to organize the silent protest parade in response to the East St. Louis massacre, where dozens of African Americans were killed, were really slaughtered. And this is kind of one of the places where Madam Walker and Ida B. Wells intersect. They had known each other. They had met each other some years earlier, I think at a National Association of Colored Women's convention. But they had common cause, even though Madam Walker was a businesswoman and Ida B. Wells was a journalist and an activist. Madam Walker, as a businesswoman, wasn't just making money for herself. She cared very deeply about what was going on in the community. So she died before she had the right to vote, but she was very much supportive of women's suffrage. I learned today in another conversation with Michelle that one of the things Ida B. Wells was trying to do was provide housing for people in her community. Madam Walker had actually bought property to try to build houses, but it's really in this lynching area where they intersect. So Ida B. Wells was in the trenches doing the reporting, doing the investigative reporting, documenting what was going on. Madam Walker was working with the NAACP, and just before she died, and in addition to this sort of supporting this anti-lynching legislation, just before she died, she pledged $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund. And that was the largest gift the organization had ever received. So she was using her profits from her business to be a social activist. So Michelle, as Michelle knows, and I'm happy to talk about the Netflix series after this, but Michelle was at the White House when this legislation was finally signed 100 years later. So Michelle, you may want to talk about that.
Yeah, well, 124 years later, from the time that Ida B. Wells first went to talk to President William S. McKinley. So yeah, it's in over 200 attempts for the legislation to pass as well. Yeah, so I mean, I'll just say, obviously what Ida B. Wells did and what Madam C.J. Walker did are very important, and people need to learn about these women and be inspired by them. But one of the things that I try to do in my work is to tie what these, our ancestors did, the work that they did, and the initiatives that they were involved in, to what is happening today. Because as much as some people might not see the relevance of history and how it makes sense of what's happening today. But I really believe that it is very key. And actually, this is not ancient history. Some people want to think, well, we all hear this, like, what does it have to do with me? Or that was a long time ago. I wasn't there, and it's not my fault, or whatever my ancestors. We've all heard this, but it's like, it does impact what happens today. I was watching a show the other day about specifically Chicago, and they were talking about, the nonsense that went on not even that long ago. It was in the 1940s and 50s, when it came to housing, and sort of all of these barriers that were put in place that made it difficult for Black people to actually purchase property. And so, hello, that makes a difference as far as this, quote, wealth gap now, this racial wealth gap. And so, for instance, when it comes to my great grandmother's story, or her work that she was doing, what Alelia just mentioned, as far as the East St. Louis massacre, East St. Louis, Illinois massacre, that is an entire community. It was a predominantly Black community, and there were Black communities all over the country. There were what we call freedom towns, freedmen's towns, that sprung up right after the Civil War. There, because of Jim Crow laws and all these other things, ways that made it very difficult for us to sort of integrate and become fully able to take advantage of what this country supposedly is about. We created our own in so many different situations. And time after time after time, a lot of these communities were destroyed or they were systematically starved economically. I mean, there are systems, there are institutions, there are policies that happened in this country that create the situation that we have today. And so I personally think it's really important for people to understand the past so that they can understand the present, and sort of understand that a lot of the differences that we have in this country are not based on individual choices, but they're based on systems. And and so we can go down the line when it comes to different areas of life. But if you talk about healthcare, it's a big thing that people are talking about now. There's a direct line from the past on why there are priorities when it comes to education, when it comes to housing, when it comes to business ownership, land ownership, on and on. And these are the things that my great grandmother was documenting during her time. And so if people even read her writing, they will understand what's happening today. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is help people see the connections, and see that it's important, to really understand what happened before, because it helps you understand why things are the way they are today and how we can solve some of the issues.
So
I have to,
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead, Aaliyah. I have to exhale on that because I took the word, and Aaliyah, please continue.
Yeah. No, I just what Michelle is saying is really important. I think the years that I spent working in daily news and being a journalist, but also now having essentially taught myself history and trying to put American history into a context where that I'm telling through the women in my family, from Madam Walker, who was born right after the Civil War, who died right after World War One, her daughter, who was born during Jim Crow and died right in the midst of the Depression. And then to bring it forward, you really do see all of these things, the things that the right wing does not want taught in schools, and that is the systemic racism, the institutional racism, the things with voting rights. As soon as we got the right to vote in the 1860s, there was backlash. As soon as we had civil rights legislation in the 1960s, there was backlash. As soon as women got rights, reproductive rights in the 70s, there's been backlash. And so there is a 50-year arc of pushing back to the point now where you have a Supreme Court that is so unbalanced that that right-wing ideas that are not really shared by the majority of Americans are really taking hold. So when people are saying it doesn't matter who I vote for, it just it makes me nuts. But I do understand that there's a lot of persuasion that we have to do. Now, into your question about Self-Made, the Netflix series. So my book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, is a book that I wrote using lots of research, lots of original documents. We're really fortunate to have literally thousands of pages of Madam Walker's personal letters and thousands of pages of her business records. So I'm able to document her life. And then the combination of doing research in other papers, in Booker T. Washington. I had the advantage of Michelle's great grandmother's book, Crusade for Justice, where she mentions Madam Walker, so I could take a little episode and little bits and pieces to tell that story. So I really wanted to lay an historically accurate foundation to tell not just Madam Walker's life, but the life of the people she knew, the famous people she knew, whether it was Ida B. Wells or Mary McLeod Bethune or Mary Church Terrell, as well as the women who were part of her army of agents, because of what that meant for women's economic independence. So that was the story that I was trying to tell. when one writes books and Hollywood is looking for stories, my book was optioned. And I had gone through a number of false starts, and finally chose a producer, and I chose that producer because I had the impression that I would be very involved in helping to shape the narrative. But once the film was sold to a studio, I was excluded from the process, even though I had what was called script approval, but not script veto. And so I had to fight, my agent had to fight for me to get them to send me the scripts. And the writer, who was another Black woman, and I had a conversation early on, and she said to me that she wanted to focus on the conflict, the rivalry between Madam Walker and Annie Malone, because that's such a cliche to have two Black women fighting each other. I wanted Hidden Figures, and I feel like she had a sensibility for Real Housewives of Atlanta. So they excluded me from the conversation with the studios. Finally, when I saw the script, it was my worst fear that it was really focused on kind of a fake fight, that it was a made up battle over skin color, and the first script had them calling each other the N word and the B word and physically fighting. So that was I had set the bar very low. Don't make me cringe, and I cringed. Well, ultimately, the 4-part series aired. Now, Octavia Spencer was great. I will always feel that she did the best she could with the script she was given. And so I'm grateful for that. But I think overall, and a lot of people worked really hard on it, and people can read an article that I wrote about it. It's pinned to the top of my page on X, Twitter. So if you click that on, you'll see exactly what I think about it without me having to go into more detail now. But it is to tie this to what happened in the past and what happened now. Hollywood has a really bad track record of portraying Black people, and it starts with Birth of a Nation. And there are some really good things that are on now. I thought Hidden Figures was good. I think Ava DuVernay does, good work. I think there are people who have a lot of integrity, but I think there is a lot of pressure, especially with Black showrunners like the ones who were self-made, who feel that they have to lean into some of the cliches, I guess, to please whoever they think they need to please.
No, that's well taken. And Michelle, as well. They say sex sells and messiness sells. It doesn't, but we're going to keep it moving. You're absolutely right.
But it does sell, but our stories don't have to be told in that way. There's amazing drama. A story has to have conflict. I mean, that's the nature of a good novel, of a good movie. But there are real stories that, in the hands of an excellent writer and director, can be told with integrity.
Yeah, I mean, you think about movies like Silkwood or Aaron Brockovich, or some of these other films, those are just the ones that come off the top of my head, of women who fought against systems that didn't have, people calling each other crazy names and fighting each other and all of that. So it's not like they can't do it. It's just that there's not the desire to do it. And that is one thing that I kind of want to just sort of mention. One of the challenges that I don't know, I haven't asked Aurelia about this, but I would just say for myself, one of the challenges that I have encountered in doing the work that I am, I made the choice to get in the arena of narrative telling and sort of narrative correcting, because I was just not happy with some of the images that I saw and some of the stories that I saw being told, and I felt like it was very imbalanced, and not only about my family situation, but just in general, like the Black experience. I felt it was very imbalanced, told in a skewed way, and so But the thing that's so interesting is that it takes a lot of effort. I really hope that people understand that what Alelia and I are doing is really not easy. And we don't know this information and are not writing books about our ancestors because we just um, inherently know this information because we happen to be born in these families. We are actually doing an incredible amount of research, an incredible amount of work to unearth the information and looking at primary documents, going into archives, doing work that other scholars are doing. Um, need to be recognized for the actual professionalism that we bring to the table here. It's not just that we are related to these people. She and I, in and of ourselves, are extremely, on the same level as all these other scholars out here. But the other challenge that I am finding is, I mean, it's sort of an interesting sort of conundrum as far as the more people learn about Ida B. Wells and are inspired by her and want to call her their shero and other things, the more difficult it is to maintain control over her story because people want to latch on to who she was and pick and choose which part of her story that works for them. And so it's just this interesting kind of challenge to sort of, I guess I would say, like, maintain control, and maintain sort of ownership over your own family story, because it becomes a story that people feel like it belongs to the public. It belongs to them too, and it's like, so it gets to be challenging to constantly try to make sure that the story is right and that it's done in a respectful way, and that it's yeah, I mean, just that the information is accurate and the person is being used in a way that fits their actual legacy, because some people like to fit who they think Ida was and probably who they think Madam was into sort of their own agenda, that might be out of alignment with who who these women actually were. And so that's just an interesting, dynamic that a lot of people don't have. But I just wanted to mention it because it is a reality that many of us are dealing with when we're trying to uphold these legacies. You talk about legacy. This is a legacy that is part of American history, but along with it comes other dynamics.
Well, yeah, Michelle, it's so true. I mean, I think we've both had our situations with people with right wing politicians who want to claim Madam Walker and Ida B. Wells and really pervert what they were about. And you may want to talk about your situation, but there are a couple of people, Dinesh D'Souza and Glenn Beck, and even the former president who read Madam Walker's name in a Black History Month proclamation. I'm like, he has no idea who she is. But the others are, oh well, if Madam Walker could pull herself up by her bootstraps, why can't the rest of these people? And some Black and not just, I won't say just, not just Black Republican, but sort of right wing MAGA kinds of folks who want to use her. And it's like, you don't have any idea what she was about, that she was Black Lives Matter 1.0, that she was spied upon
Mhm.
by a Black spy, and along with Ida B. Wells, called a Negro subversive. And so, yes, they need to tell the stories properly. I mean, I think that's one of my, a footnote on the self-made is that Madam Walker's story was so much about empowering other women. It was the women of the AME Church in St. Louis who saw something in her, who mentored her, who gave her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman, who were really a community for her. So that when she began to be successful, she was infused with that idea of women collaborating with each other. That was not really a part of this film, but that for me would have been what I would have leaned into. That even the title "self-made" is problematic for me, because there's a scholar who talks about mutually made. That was really what her community was about, mutual assistance. So, yes, just not just sort of missing the point is
Mhm.
sometimes problematic.
I totally agree. Ladies, in the few minutes that we have, and we do have about 18 minutes to go, I do honor your time. Alelia, I'd like you to talk about your projects and how people can get in contact you, particularly about your books, because I have two of your books. So can you
Well,
just take a few
thank you
minutes?
so much. So, the two main books, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, that's the comprehensive biography. It's also available in addition to paperback, it's on ebook, but also on audio book, which I read. So, if you're like me, it's really hard to find time to sit down and read a book. I listen to a lot of books on Audible, so I hope people will consider On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. And then I have a book written for children called All About Madam C.J. Walker, and it's only $6.99, and you can buy one for all of your children and grandchildren. Uh, and it's a short, quick read. And if you don't feel like reading a long biography, that's a good way to read it. And then I have another book, one of those Arcadia publishing books that we've all seen in the drugstore on the rack with 200 photographs, called Madam Walker Theater Center and Indianapolis Treasures. So, and the new book that I am in the process of doing the final edits on is called Joy Goddess, Alelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, and it will be out next spring. And then we've got, other kinds of things. There's a Madam Walker Barbie, and we have products that are at the National Archives Foundation. So there's always something new. I'm always getting calls from people who want to do product. And just to, sort of circle back with what Michelle is saying, there are people who try to make things and they don't, they sneak around and try to make things, and you have to call them on it. And some things I'm happy to partner with people, and some things I just don't feel really fit who I want the legacy to be.
I love it. I love it. Michelle, what's going on with you that you want the audience to know about your current project? And please talk about the books that you have, because we need to buy your books, ladies.
Yes.
Right. Well, I've written two books about Ida B. Wells. There's Ida B. the Queen, the extraordinary life and legacy of Ida B. Wells, which is geared towards, I would say, teenagers and up. And what I did in that book is not a traditional biography. It's a book about that ties what I was saying earlier. It ties the work that Ida did with contemporary issues and contemporary people, to kind of show how the work that she was doing and the issues that she was addressing, unfortunately, are still with us, maybe in a different form, but there is a continuum. And then I wrote a children's picture book called Ida B. Wells' Voice of Truth, which is for little kids. So those are two completely different reading levels, for that I have written. I wrote the afterword for her autobiography called Crusade for Justice. So that reading level is a little more advanced. Um, and I've also written some other books that are not about Ida. I've edited a couple of anthologies. One was called Shifts, an Anthology for Women, Women's Growth Through Change, which is a collection of writing by 35 different women who wrote about how they grew, as a result of going through some kind of a setback or disappointment or change in their lives. I also co-edited Impact, Personal Portraits of Activism, which is also a collective of writing. It's by men and women about how sort of smaller acts of activism matter, And so it's personal stories of things that people did in order to make an impact on their community or their organization. My friend and I co-edited that because we felt it was important. I get a lot of questions of like, oh, Ida B. Wells was, she did all of these things. What can I do? And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to write a book about this. Here's what you can do. And here's what people have done before, because I think sometimes people feel like it's so big, it's so intimidating to change the world. It's like you don't have to change the whole world. You can change your block, you can change your church, you can change your school, you can change what is within your sphere of influence, and it all matters. So I'm really proud of that book. But I've also worked on a lot of public history projects, and I started doing this work not knowing that there was such a thing called public history. I didn't know there was like a title. But when I heard the term, I'm like, whoa, that's what I'm doing, which is basically creating projects to give public spaces. And so I've worked on a huge monument to Ida here in Chicago, which is at 37th and Lenox. And I in Memphis. She's one of the 13 people that's included in that monument. Alelia and I are both involved with this Women's National Monument, Suffrage Monument, which is the goal is to have the very first monument to honor women on the Mall in Washington, D.C. So I'm involved in that effort, and that's all I can think of off the top of my head. There's so many things I'm doing. I'm working on a sequel for a little children's book that I co-wrote, where there's a little boy who's like learning history from the historical figures. So in the first book, there were 28 historical figures, and now we're working on another book with, like, when I say we, I'm co-writing. I like to collaborate. It's fun to me to work with other people, to bounce ideas off of. But anyway, this little boy, he's going on a road trip, and he's going to meet some more people. And so to me, it's fun to write for different age groups and to work on projects that help people come in contact with the history in different ways. And I think they all sort of complement each other. So for instance, if somebody encounters the monument and they never heard of Ida B. Wells before, they can learn a little bit about her from the plaque that has a short bio of her on the monument. But then they can say, who is this woman? And they can Google her. And I've written several articles that you can find online about her. So you don't even have to read a whole book. You can read an article about her, or you can read a children's book, and then you can watch a movie. I've been involved in a couple of documentary films that are about her. So I've just worked in a lot of different mediums because I think it's kind of fun, to have the information in different forms and different mediums that appeal to different ages, different reading levels. I don't really like to correlate age with reading level because that might not match, and so to me, it's just all about reading level. And recently decided, and I have the opportunity to work with Rebellious Magazine, which is an online magazine geared towards Black women. And so I'm going to be writing a series of basically essays that are doing what I said I want to do, which is like tie history to the present. And so every month it'll be kind of a different topic.
Wow. That's a great synopsis. As we're closing out, Michelle and Alelia, I'm going to ask the same question to Michelle. What would you like to leave the audience with? Please take your time. Usually what I do, Alelia, Michelle, you know this. You're on top of the mountain. I'm going to say Mount Kilimanjaro because I actually went there, Michelle and Alelia, which is in Arusha, which is on the continent of Africa, Tanzania. And you're on top of that mountain, Alelia, and you have the command of the world. Let's just pretend. And everyone's looking at you, right? What would you like to share that's inspirational or just a comment to the masses of the people of this world? Alelia, you have the mic, and I'm going to give it to Michelle, and then we're going to close out, ladies.
You know, well, at this moment, I just really think we are in such a critical time, and it is almost a cliche, but democracy is at stake. And we as Black people and we as women have to stand up. We cannot be quiet. We cannot expect somebody else to solve the problems, but our very being, our health, our reproductive rights, our voting rights, our education, our schools, all of these things are in jeopardy. And so voting can seem like a little thing, it can seem like it doesn't make a difference, but every vote counts. And it's not just voting. We have to vote. That's like the basic thing. But we have to speak up, and everybody can't speak up. For me, the beauty of being 71 years old and having had my corporate life behind me is that I can say things that somebody who may feel constrained in their work cannot say. I speak up. Even in my hometown of Indianapolis, there are projects, preservation projects that I'm working on. I am challenging people who don't expect me to be the one who's challenging them. But I don't owe anybody anything, and nobody owes me anything. And so I feel that I must speak truth to power. So, to the degree that I can encourage people to vote and to use their voice for themselves and use the voice when others cannot speak up.
I love it. Thank you so much, Alelia. Michelle, you're going to have the final words as we close out.
I mean, the first thing that came to mind is really to, I guess, the golden rule of, treat other people as you would like to be treated. I just feel that if we could do that, then a lot of the other problems would be solved, of just treating people with dignity and respect, and having some compassion. I think that's what we're kind of missing. And so, yeah, I think that if that were possible, if I could wave a magic wand over the world, that's what it would be. And I think we would have democracy, and I think we would have equity in all these other areas if people just looked at other people with the same level of care that they look at themselves or their immediate family, and like we're all one family, and we need to treat each other that way.
And Alelia and Michelle, and that community is legacy. Alelia and Michelle, please share with my community how we can reach you, how we can follow you, and more importantly, how we can sow some seeds and buy some of these books, ladies.
So my websites are www.aleliabundles.com, ALELIA bundles.com, and madamcjwalker.com, MADAMCJWalker.com. The books are On Her Own Ground and all about Madam C.J. Walker.
Yeah.
Michelle?
My website is MLD Writes, WRITES. And you can find me on Twitter at Michelle Duster, Instagram at Michelle Duster, Facebook at MLD Writes. And I think I should know, but I think on LinkedIn, I think it's in Michelle Duster.
It's
type my name
definitely
in LinkedIn, you'll find me.
Right.
Yeah, we're going to talk about
And my Twitter, Facebook, Instagram is at Alelia Bundles. I try to keep it easy like Michelle does.
I'm telling you, I love you, ladies. And Michelle, it is because I was on your social media on LinkedIn. So I got to talk to my store. Michelle, we got to step it up. There's a lot of activity on LinkedIn. I had to go, and it was like 3 Michelle Dusters. Had to make sure I linked onto the right Michelle Dusters. Well, family, you've heard it from the best. I want to thank these women. I want y'all to show me some love. And you can show Bella some love by purchasing, supporting family. You know where I come from. Let's not talk out the side of our neck. Now let's just say everything was nice. Let's put our money where our mouths are. Let's follow these beautiful women. Let's read. Let's read. Let's read. You don't have to buy a hardback or a paperback. You can actually download, right? Come on, Lily. Come on, Michelle. Because I actually have it on my Kindle because I do a lot of reading on Kindle while I'm in Atlanta traffic, ladies, trying to get somewhere in 30 minutes. It takes 2 hours. I am listening to my books. So please support. We need it. I want to thank you, ladies, for coming in. That's it for tonight. I love you all. Please show some love by supporting these women. On behalf of the Bella Unplugged, I'd like to thank everyone. Have a wonderful, safe, and prosperous weekend. Good night, everybody.